When Preston Whitman and his crew cornered Alicia Washington in the school courtyard and ripped her only good dress, the one her grandmother saved for months to buy. 50 students watched through their phones as this scholarship girl's world shattered in front of everyone. But what they captured next wasn't tears or shame. It was 12 years of bottled rage erupting like a volcano, and by the time the dust settled, 3-star athletes were in ambulances, and Riverside Prep's darkest secrets were trending nationwide. If you've ever felt powerless watching injustice happen, this story will remind you why silence isn't always golden, and why sometimes the quietest voices create the loudest change. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Prep Academy's manicured campus as Alicia Washington stepped off the city bus at exactly 7:30 a.m. At 17, she moved through the world like a ghost, deliberately invisible in oversized sweaters and worn jeans that marked her as different from the designer-clad legacy students who arrived in BMWs and Teslas. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the stares of curiosity and judgment that followed her through marble hallways lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, all of whom looked remarkably similar in their pale uniformity. Riverside Prep sat like a fortress in Connecticut's wealthiest district, its Gothic towers and ivy-covered walls housing 2,000 students whose parents controlled boardrooms, political campaigns, and generational wealth. The school's annual tuition of $45,000 per year ensured that diversity remained carefully curated. 5% scholarship students scattered among 95% inherited privilege, like tokens of progressive thinking. Alicia clutched her worn backpack tighter as she navigated toward her locker. The weight of advanced placement textbooks, nothing compared to the constant pressure of proving she belonged. Her grandmother, Rosa, had worked 3 jobs to ensure Alicia could accept the full scholarship, cleaning office buildings until midnight, then stocking grocery shelves before dawn, all while maintaining the small apartment that smelled like lavender candles and unfulfilled dreams. The sacrifice hung heavy on Alicia's shoulders. Every A grade a small payment on an impossible debt of gratitude. What none of her classmates knew was that beneath the shy exterior and careful invisibility lay something far more dangerous. 12 years of training in Uncle Marcus's Southside boxing gym had forged steel in her bones and lightning in her fists. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, she caught the bus to Chicago's roughest neighborhood, where her uncle taught kids like her that sometimes the world demanded you fight back. The shy girl routine wasn't weakness, it was camouflage. 3 floors above, in the exclusive White Room study lounge, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms on mahogany tables. Preston Whitman sat surrounded by his carefully curated inner circle. At 18, he possessed the kind of effortless arrogance that came from never hearing the word no. His sandy hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes calculating as he scrolled through his phone with manicured fingers. The quarterback's letterman jacket hung loose on his athletic frame, each varsity letter representing another step toward the Harvard acceptance that was his birthright. Beside him, Chad Brennan cracked his knuckles with methodical precision. The wrestling captain's massive frame coiled with barely contained violence. At 6'4" and 220 pounds, Chad served as Preston's enforcer, though few knew that his aggression stemmed from nightly battles with his alcoholic father's fists. The abuse had taught him that strength meant inflicting pain before receiving it, a lesson he'd learned to apply with surgical precision. Kyle Morrison completed the triangle of power, his fingers dancing across 3 different phones as he managed his 100,000-follower TikTok empire, where Preston provided the plans and Chad delivered the muscle. Kyle wielded the most modern weapon of all, the ability to destroy reputations with viral humiliation. His cherubic face and innocent smile masked a genius for psychological warfare that had driven 2 students to transfer schools in the past year alone. The tension that would eventually explode had been building since October, when college admission results leaked through the administrative grapevine. Alicia Washington, the quiet scholarship girl who cleaned tables in the cafeteria, had received a full ride to Harvard. Preston Whitman, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and son of Senator Catherine Whitman, had been waitlisted despite his family's 7-figure donations to the university's endowment fund. The news had hit Preston like a physical blow, his perfect world cracking along fault lines he'd never imagined existed. How could someone from the projects, someone who literally served his leftovers, achieve what his bloodline and bank account couldn't guarantee? The injustice of merit trumping money felt like a personal attack on everything he'd been raised to believe about natural order and inherited privilege. Kyle had been the first to suggest action, his phone already pulling up Alicia's sparse social media presence. "Look at this," he'd whispered, showing screenshots of her thrift store clothes and modest apartment. "Girl thinks she can just waltz in here and take what belongs to us." The pronoun choice was deliberate. In Kyle's world, Harvard acceptance wasn't earned, but inherited, passed down through generations like China patterns and trust funds. Chad's contribution had been more direct. "Someone needs to teach her about respect," he'd growled, his scarred knuckles telling their own story. "Show her what happens when you forget your place." The irony of his words, spoken by someone whose own place was defined by violence and fear, was lost in the echo chamber of privilege and resentment. The campaign began subtly, as the most effective cruelties often do. An anonymous Instagram account called Riverside Truth appeared overnight. Its first post featuring Alicia's school photo with devil horns drawn in digital red ink. "Scholarship girl thinks she belongs with real students." Read the caption, followed by a flood of comments from accounts with suspiciously generic names. The psychological torture escalated with surgical precision. Study groups that had included her suddenly became invitation only. Project partners developed convenient scheduling conflicts. Even teachers began treating her differently, their smiles strained as they calculated the political cost of supporting someone who'd apparently made powerful enemies. Kyle's masterstroke came during lunch on a gray November afternoon, when he accidentally discovered Alicia's part-time job in the cafeteria. Hidden cameras captured her wiping down tables and emptying trash cans. Honest work transformed into humiliation through the lens of entitled privilege. "Harvard girl serving our leftovers," Kyle posted with theatrical irony. "Guess we know where she really belongs." The video exploded across social media platforms like wildfire, gathering 10,000 views in 2 hours as students shared and commented with mob-like enthusiasm. Alicia watched her dignity disintegrate in real time. Each share and laugh emoji, another small death of the carefully constructed identity she'd built to survive in this hostile environment. But the digital harassment was only the beginning. Preston's desperation had grown with each passing week, his perfect facade cracking under pressure from his senator mother and pharmaceutical executive father. The family dinner conversations had turned increasingly cold. Discussions of legacy and disappointment served alongside organic vegetables and vintage wine. When his Harvard rejection letter arrived in December, sealed with the crimson disappointment of dreams deferred, something fundamental had snapped inside him. The gambling addiction had started innocently enough. Poker games with college friends that escalated into underground high-stakes tournaments. Steroid use had followed, a chemical shortcut to maintaining his athletic dominance when natural talent wasn't enough. Now, he owed $47,000 to people who collected debts with crowbars and gasoline, and his trust fund remained locked until his 21st birthday. Alicia had become the perfect scapegoat for his mounting failures, a visible reminder that merit could triumph over money, that the system he'd been raised to manipulate might actually reward the deserving over the entitled. In his cocaine-fueled paranoia, she represented everything wrong with modern America, a world where Harvard would choose a cafeteria worker's granddaughter over a senator's son. The final plan crystallized during a December strategy session in the White Room, where privilege plotted against poverty with clinical precision. Kyle had done his research, discovering through careful digital stalking that Alicia wore the same navy blue dress for every important presentation. Further investigation revealed its significance, a gift from her grandmother Rosa, purchased with 3 months of overtime wages and presented with tears of pride and hope. "We destroy the dress, we destroy her," Preston had said with the casual cruelty that money often mistakes for strategy. Public humiliation during the Harvard celebration assembly. 500 witnesses. Cameras rolling. No way to cover it up or explain it away. Chad's job was simple: create a distraction, while Preston executed the plan. Kyle would ensure optimal camera angles and real-time social media distribution. The assembly was perfect. Alicia would be on stage, receiving recognition for her scholarship, exposed and vulnerable before the entire school community. What none of them realized was that their target had spent 12 years learning that sometimes prey becomes predator, that quiet girls often carry the loudest thunder, and that cornering someone with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous game of all. The morning of the Harvard celebration assembly dawned crisp and clear, February sunlight streaming through Riverside Prep's stained glass windows like divine spotlight. Alicia stood before her bedroom mirror in the small apartment she shared with grandmother Rosa, carefully smoothing the navy blue dress that had come to symbolize so much more than fabric and hope. Rosa Washington shuffled into the room carrying a cup of coffee, her weathered hands gentle as she adjusted her granddaughter's collar. At 72, she carried the weight of 3 generations on her shoulders, having raised Alicia since her parents died in a car crash when she was 5. "You look beautiful, baby girl," she whispered, her voice thick with pride and decades of sacrifice. "Your mama and daddy would be so proud." The dress had cost $347. Every penny earned through extra shifts at the office building where Rosa cleaned toilets and emptied trash cans. She'd saved for 6 months, skipping lunches and walking to work to afford public transportation savings, all to buy her granddaughter something beautiful for the most important day of her young life. Alicia touched the pearl buttons that Rosa had sewn on herself, each one a small prayer for a future different from the one poverty had prescribed. "I love you, Grandma," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude that could never be fully expressed. "Thank you for everything." The bus ride to school felt different that morning, anticipation mixing with anxiety as Alicia prepared to accept public recognition for achievements that had cost her family everything. Students would learn today that the quiet girl who cleaned their tables had earned something their money couldn't buy. Respect based on merit rather than inheritance. Preston Whitman arrived at school in his mother's Mercedes, his hands shaking slightly from the Adderall and espresso combination that had become his daily cocktail. The plan played on repeat in his mind, like a movie he'd watched too many times. Every detail memorized, every contingency considered. Today, he would remind the scholarship girl and everyone else about the natural order of things, about who really belonged at Riverside Prep, and who was merely visiting. Kyle Morrison checked his equipment one final time. 3 phones charged and positioned. Camera angles optimized for maximum viral potential. His followers were already primed with teaser posts about something epic happening at the assembly today, and the hashtag Riverside Reality was ready to trend. Though none of his audience understood, they were about to witness psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Chad Brennan shadowboxed in the empty wrestling room, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he prepared for his role in the coming destruction. Violence had been his first language since childhood. The grammar of bruises and broken bones more familiar than poetry or mathematics. Today, he would speak it fluently once again. The assembly hall filled with controlled chaos as 500 students found their seats. Teachers lining the walls like sentinels of order and authority. Principal Davidson stood at the podium adjusting his microphone, unaware that he was about to preside over the systematic destruction of a student under his protection. The irony would haunt him for years, how institutional blindness enabled individual cruelty. Alicia sat in the front row with other scholarship recipients, her navy blue dress a splash of hope among the designer uniforms that surrounded her. She felt exposed despite being fully clothed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness, and everything to do with being the only person in the room whose presence was considered temporary and conditional. Preston positioned himself 3 rows behind her, close enough to execute the plan, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. His crew flanked him like Secret Service agents, each knowing their role in the orchestrated humiliation about to unfold. The weight of $47,000 in gambling debt pressed against his chest like a physical anchor. Reminder that failure wasn't just personal, but potentially fatal. Principal Davidson's voice crackled through the sound system as he began introducing the scholarship recipients. Each name met with polite applause from an audience that understood achievement was being celebrated, but not necessarily respected. These students represent the best of what merit-based selection can accomplish. He droned, unaware of the bitter irony his words carried in ears trained to hear privilege above performance. When Alicia's name echoed through the assembly hall, she rose with fluid grace and walked toward the stage. Every step watched by cameras disguised as phones and eyes sharp with anticipation. The navy blue dress caught the spotlight, like hope made visible. Grandmother Rosa's sacrifice transformed into symbol of possibility and pride. But as she climbed the steps to accept recognition for achievements that had cost her family everything, Preston Whitman rose from his seat with calculated precision, his hand reaching for the coffee cup that would change everything in ways none of them could possibly imagine. The assembly hall held its breath without knowing why. 500 witnesses about to learn what happens when privilege declares war on poverty. When entitlement meets its match in someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The moment stretched like a held breath as Alicia reached the podium, her fingers touching the microphone that would carry her voice to every corner of the assembly hall. Principal Davidson smiled his practiced smile as he prepared to shake her hand, completely unaware that 3 rows behind them, Preston Whitman was rising from his seat with the cold precision of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Kyle Morrison's fingers hovered over his phone screen, 3 devices positioned at perfect angles to capture what was about to become the most viral moment in Riverside Prep's history. His 100,000 followers had no idea they were about to witness something that would make headlines far beyond social media, something that would transform a quiet scholarship girl into a symbol of resistance that would echo through generations. Chad Brennan's massive frame tensed like a coiled spring, every muscle prepared to play his part in the systematic destruction of someone whose only crime was achieving what money couldn't buy. The scars on his knuckles told stories of violence learned in childhood and perfected through years of channeling pain into power. But today, he would discover that some prey bites back with interest. And Alicia Washington, standing at the podium in her grandmother's carefully saved-for dress, felt something shift deep in her chest as she looked out at 500 faces that ranged from supportive to hostile to completely indifferent. 12 years of Uncle Marcus's training whispered in her muscles, years of careful invisibility, about to explode into something none of them would ever forget. The coffee cup in Preston's hand seemed to move in slow motion as he took that first deliberate step toward the stage, toward the moment that would change everything for everyone in that room, toward the collision between inherited privilege and earned strength that would leave 3 young men unconscious and an entire school system examining its soul. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform on Earth, analyzed by experts and debated by politicians, transformed into symbol and metaphor and warning about what happens when you corner someone who has spent their entire life learning how to fight back. But in that frozen moment, before chaos erupted, before phones started recording and lives started changing, there was only silence, the kind of absolute quiet that comes before thunder, before lightning, before the kind of storm that tears down everything in its path and leaves the landscape forever altered. Preston's foot hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the silence, and Alicia Washington turned toward the noise with eyes that suddenly blazed with something far more dangerous than anyone in that room had ever imagined possible. The war was about to begin. Preston Whitman moved with predatory grace toward the stage, his designer coffee cup held like a weapon of social destruction. The Assembly Hall's 500 witnesses had no idea they were about to observe the moment when privilege finally overplayed its hand, when inherited arrogance met its match, in someone who had spent 12 years learning that sometimes survival requires violence. "Congratulations, Alicia," Preston called out with theatrical enthusiasm as he approached the podium, his voice carrying just loud enough for the microphones to capture every syllable. "Let me be the first to welcome you to the Harvard family." His smile was pure poison wrapped in perfect teeth, the kind of expression that money taught and cruelty perfected. Alicia turned toward his voice, something cold and calculating shifting behind her eyes as she recognized the predatory gleam in his gaze. 12 years of Uncle Marcus's training had taught her to read violence before it arrived, to recognize the microsecond when pretense dropped and genuine malice emerged. Preston Whitman was done playing games. "Thank you, Preston," she replied carefully, her voice steady despite the alarm bells screaming in her subconscious. Every instinct told her to run, to escape whatever trap was closing around her. But 500 pairs of eyes and dozens of recording phones made retreat impossible. She was trapped on stage like an animal in a coliseum, surrounded by spectators hungry for blood and entertainment. Kyle Morrison's fingers danced across 3 phone screens simultaneously, each device positioned at optimal angles to capture what was about to become the most viral moment in social media history. His 100,000 followers were already primed with teaser posts, hashtags ready to explode across platforms the moment violence erupted. Chad Brennan rose from his seat with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting violence, his massive frame moving through the crowd like death incarnate. At 6'4" and 220 pounds of muscle and rage, he was Preston's nuclear option, the enforcer who ensured plans succeeded through intimidation and pain. Principal Davidson continued his speech about merit and achievement, completely oblivious to the psychological warfare unfolding 3 feet from his podium. The irony would haunt him forever, how he celebrated academic excellence while enabling the systematic destruction of the very student he was honoring. Preston reached the stage steps with coffee cup in hand, his movements casual and friendly to anyone watching from a distance. But Alicia saw the tension in his shoulders, the predatory focus in his eyes, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched like someone preparing for violence. Uncle Marcus had taught her that wolves always smiled before they attacked. "You know," Preston said conversationally as he climbed toward the podium, his voice carrying the false intimacy of shared secrets, "I've been thinking about your scholarship all morning. It's really quite remarkable how unexpected these things can be." The word unexpected dripped with venom disguised as admiration. Kyle's fingers flew across his screens as he began live streaming to multiple platforms simultaneously, his followers watching in real time as their entertainment emperor prepared to deliver content that would break the internet. The comments section exploded with anticipation, thousands of viewers sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Chad positioned himself at the base of the stage, his scarred knuckles telling stories of violence learned in childhood and perfected through years of channeling pain into power. The wrestling captain had never lost a fight, had never faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated into submission through sheer physical presence. Alicia's grandmother, Rosa, sat in the audience's front row, her weathered hands clasped in prayer as she watched her granddaughter accept recognition for achievements that had cost their family everything. The navy blue dress she'd saved 6 months to purchase caught the spotlight like hope made visible. Every pearl button a small prayer for a future different from the one poverty had prescribed. "The thing about scholarships," Preston continued as he reached Alicia's position, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, "is that they're really just charity. Aren't they a way for people like you to pretend you belong in places like this?" His words were surgical strikes designed to cut deep, but something had changed in Alicia's eyes, something cold and calculating that made Preston's confident smirk falter for just a moment. The shy girl routine was dissolving like morning mist, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Uncle Marcus's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes they push you until you got no choice but to push back." Baby girl. Kyle's live stream had attracted 50,000 viewers in real time, comments flooding the screen so fast they became an incomprehensible blur of anticipation and bloodlust. His followers sensed that history was being made, that they were about to witness content that would define viral culture for generations. "You know what the problem is with charity cases like you," Preston whispered, his coffee cup positioned directly above Alicia's carefully pressed dress. "You start thinking you actually earned what you've been given. You forget that people like me could take it all away with a single phone call." His hand began to tilt, coffee threatening to spill across the navy blue fabric. That's when Alicia Washington made the decision that would change everything. "Go ahead," she whispered back, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made Preston's blood freeze in his veins. "Pour that coffee. Destroy my dress. But understand something first. When you corner someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose, you better be prepared for what happens next." The coffee cup slipped from Preston's suddenly nerveless fingers, splashing across Alicia's dress in a brown stain that spread like spilled blood across hope itself. The assembly hall gasped as one, 500 voices expressing shock and sympathy for what appeared to be a tragic accident. But Alicia knew better, saw the satisfaction in Preston's eyes. Kyle's phones captured every second as Preston reached out with mock concern, his hands grabbing at the stained fabric under the pretense of helping clean the mess he'd deliberately created. "Oh God, "I'm so sorry," he said loudly enough for the microphones to capture, his voice dripping with false remorse. "Let me help you with that." His fingers found the fabric and pulled, not to clean, but to tear. The dress ripped with a sound like thunder, navy blue fabric tearing along seams that Grandmother Rosa had reinforced with extra stitching and love. Alicia stood exposed in her modest undergarments before an audience of phones and cameras, her dignity shredded as deliberately as the clothing that had represented everything her family had sacrificed to purchase. But instead of tears or shame, something far more dangerous blazed to life in Alicia's eyes. The shy girl routine evaporated like steam, replaced by something forged in Uncle Marcus's gym and tempered by 12 years of learning that sometimes the world demanded you fight back. The assembly hall fell silent as 500 people realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. "You want to see what a scholarship girl can do?" Alicia asked, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium with the kind of quiet authority that made every person present lean forward in their seats. "Let me show you what 12 years of Southside boxing taught me about respect." She stepped out of the torn dress with fluid grace, standing before the crowd in her sports bra and shorts, no longer a victim, but a warrior, ready for battle. Kyle's live stream exploded past 100,000 viewers as word spread across social media that something extraordinary was happening at Riverside Prep. Comments flooded the screen faster than servers could process. Millions of people around the world sensing that they were about to witness something that would become legend. Preston backed away from the podium, his confident smirk replaced by growing alarm as he realized the girl he'd been tormenting wasn't who he thought she was. The predator suddenly found himself facing prey that had evolved into something far more dangerous. "Delete the video, Kyle," Alicia said without taking her eyes off Preston, her voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. "Delete it now, or I'll make sure you can't hold a phone for the next 6 months." The threat wasn't bluster. It was a promise delivered with absolute certainty. Kyle Morrison fumbled with his phones, his hands shaking as he realized the entertainment he'd been broadcasting might have consequences he hadn't considered. But greed overcame caution. 100,000 viewers represented viral gold. "Make me charity case," he sneered, his voice cracking with false bravado. Alicia moved like lightning given human form, crossing the 20 feet between them in 3 fluid strides that carried all the speed and precision Uncle Marcus had beaten into her bones through 12 years of relentless training. Her first jab connected with Kyle's solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the air from his lungs and sending him crashing into the row of seats behind him. The $100,000 phone flew from his nerveless fingers, shattering against the assembly hall floor. Chad Brennan roared with rage as he charged toward the stage. 220 pounds of muscle and violence, convinced that size and strength could overcome speed and skill. The wrestling captain had never faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, had never fought someone who had learned violence in places where losing meant dying. Alicia waited until Chad's massive frame committed to his takedown attempt, then sidestepped with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning that survival meant using an opponent's strength against them. Her uppercut caught him under the chin with the kind of precision that comes from thousands of hours of practice, snapping his head back and sending his unconscious body crashing through the wooden chairs like a falling tree. The assembly hall erupted in chaos as 500 students realized they were witnessing something far beyond typical high school drama. Phones appeared everywhere as the modern Coliseum demanded documentation. Viral content spreading across platforms faster than administrators could comprehend. Preston Whitman found himself alone on stage with someone who had just proven that money couldn't buy protection from consequences. The quarterback, who had terrorized classmates through social status and family connections, suddenly faced an opponent who measured worth through action rather than inheritance. "This is insane," Preston stammered, backing toward the stage's edge as Alicia advanced with the patient stalking of a predator who knew the hunt was already over. "You can't just attack students like this. My father will have you expelled, arrested, destroyed." "Your father," Alicia replied with casual contempt, "won't be able to protect you from the video evidence Kyle accidentally captured. You see, his phone was still recording when you confessed to destroying my dress deliberately, when you admitted this was all planned, when you revealed exactly what kind of person you really are beneath all that privilege and polish." The truth hit Preston like a physical blow as he realized Kyle's obsession with documentation had captured everything, every confession, every moment of premeditated cruelty, every second of the systematic harassment they'd orchestrated over months. The evidence that was supposed to humiliate Alicia would instead destroy everything he'd worked to build. Kyle Morrison struggled to his feet, his nose bleeding from the impact with the chairs, his hands frantically searching for phones that had scattered across the assembly hall floor. The live stream continued broadcasting his destruction to hundreds of thousands of viewers, comments exploding with shock and admiration for the scholarship girl who was single-handedly dismantling the school's power structure. "You don't understand," Preston said desperately, his voice rising to a panicked shriek that carried to every corner of the silent auditorium. "I'm Preston Whitman. My mother is Senator Catherine Whitman. My father controls half the pharmaceutical industry. You can't do this to people like us." Alicia's response was delivered with the kind of casual precision that comes from years of practice. A perfect right cross that connected with Preston's jaw with a sound like breaking wood. The quarterback's unconscious body hit the stage floor with a thud that echoed through the assembly hall like the closing of a book. The silence that followed was absolute. 500 witnesses processing what they had just observed as phones continued recording and live streams carried the destruction across social media platforms at light speed. The shy scholarship girl stood center stage in her torn dress and sports bra, surrounded by 3 unconscious bullies, no longer a victim, but a warrior who had just rewritten every rule about power and privilege at Riverside Prep. Principal Davidson finally found his voice after 30 seconds of shocked silence, his words carrying administrative panic. "Security medical assistance, someone call 911. His shouts echoed through the assembly hall as teachers finally began moving, as authorities rushed toward a stage that had become a battlefield. But the real revolution was happening in digital space, where Kyle's accidentally continued live stream had captured not just the fight, but Preston's confession, the planned nature of their harassment, the systematic cruelty they had orchestrated for months. Evidence spread across platforms faster than administrators could comprehend. Alicia Washington stood center stage as paramedics attended to 3 unconscious young men who had learned that consequences sometimes arrive wearing sports bras and carrying 12 years of boxing training. The assembly hall buzzed with the kind of excited conversation that follows moments of historical significance. Grandmother Rosa pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her arms wrapping around her granddaughter with fierce pride. "That's my baby," she whispered, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had spent 3 generations teaching the importance of fighting back when cornered. The investigation that followed would uncover years of systematic harassment, documented evidence of administrative complicity, financial connections between the Whitman family and school board that explained decades of protection for privileged bullies. Federal authorities would eventually file charges under hate crime statutes. But the real victory was measured in smaller moments. In students who found their voices after watching someone stand up to power. In policies that changed because viral videos forced institutional accountability. In conversations about privilege and justice that spread far beyond Riverside Prep's Gothic walls. 3 months later, she stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard University, delivering a speech about courage and consequence to an audience that included senators and Supreme Court justices. The torn dress had been framed and hung in the Civil Rights Museum, transformed from symbol of humiliation into monument of resistance. They tried to tear me down by destroying something my grandmother saved months to buy, she told the audience, her voice carrying quiet authority. Instead, they unleashed something they were never prepared to handle. They learned that when you corner someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose, you better be prepared for what happens next. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. 5,000 people acknowledging not just her words, but her example. The proof that sometimes individuals can change systems, that courage is contagious, that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. In the audience, Grandmother Rosa dabbed tears with a handkerchief, while Uncle Marcus smiled with fierce pride. Preston Whitman watched the speech from his prison cell, where he was serving 18 months for assault and hate crimes, his Harvard dreams replaced by mandatory therapy and community service. The pharmaceutical fortune had survived his disgrace, but barely. The family name permanently associated with privilege and cruelty. Kyle Morrison's social media empire had collapsed overnight, his followers abandoning him faster than platforms could delete his accounts. His viral fame transformed into viral infamy that followed him through multiple school transfers and therapist appointments. Chad Brennan found unexpected redemption in prison, where mandatory counseling forced him to confront the childhood trauma that had turned him into an instrument of others' cruelty. The wrestling captain who had terrorized classmates became an advocate for abuse survivors. And Alicia Washington, the shy scholarship girl who cleaned tables and earned perfect grades, became something far more important than Harvard student or boxing champion or viral sensation. She became proof that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most thunder, that courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by action despite it. The dress that started everything hung in the Smithsonian now, navy blue fabric and pearl buttons preserved behind glass like relics of a revolution that began with one girl's refusal to stay silent. Visitors read the placard that told her story, children learning that heroes sometimes wear sports bras instead of capes. Because, in the end, that's what changed everything. Not the viral videos or the court cases or the federal investigations, but the simple truth that someone finally stood up and said no. That, when faced with a choice between silence and resistance, between invisibility and justice, between accepting cruelty and fighting back, Alicia Washington chose to fight. And in that choice, she reminded an entire generation that sometimes the most important battles aren't won with words or laws or money, but with fists and courage and the absolute refusal to let evil triumph through good people's silence. The shy girl had become a warrior, and the warrior had changed the world. Years later, when students across America faced their own moments of choice between silence and resistance, they would remember Alicia Washington's name. They would think of a torn navy blue dress and 3 unconscious bullies, of viral videos that sparked congressional hearings and federal investigations. They would remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't legislation or litigation, but one person's refusal to accept that cruelty is inevitable. The ripple effects continued long after the last news camera left Riverside Prep's campus. Schools nationwide implemented zero-tolerance policies that actually meant something, where privilege couldn't purchase protection and money couldn't silence victims. The Alicia Standard became shorthand for institutional accountability, a reminder that in the digital age, truth travels faster than cover-ups, and justice delayed is justice documented. Her story lived in ways she never expected. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Parents told it at dinner tables. Coaches used it to teach young athletes about real strength versus toxic dominance. The girl who had tried so hard to remain invisible had become a beacon for anyone who had ever felt powerless. Proof that quiet people often carry the loudest thunder. If you've ever watched injustice happen and stayed silent, if you've ever been told your voice doesn't matter because of where you come from or what you look like, if you've ever felt like David staring up at Goliath, remember Alicia Washington. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Remember that sometimes the most important word you can say is no, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up and fight back. Because somewhere tonight, there's another shy girl in another school, waiting to discover that she's been a warrior all along.